I haven't been able to not notice, taking great note this year on just how things are just so symmetric throughout God's creation. So many things. I mean, when you look out around God's creation and have a chance to walk in the woods, or in my backyard, I've got probably about close to an acre of woods in the back, noticing the birds, listening to cardinals. My daughter has been bringing to my attention the different tweets. Not that birds are tweeting. I mean, different tweets. The tweet, woo-hoo. And how she can recognize certain birds, whether they be cardinals or, I guess, bluebirds and what have you. And they do have a difference. I mean, it is when you really stop and listen and you look at things also, you notice that there's a lot of symmetry in God's creation. I mean, from a leaf to a snowflake. I don't know if you've ever looked at snowflakes and really took a close look at them in a snowstorm and let them land on your hand and just try to look at them as they pile up on your hand, how they're all different, every one of them. I mean, it's just crystallized water, so to speak, a snowflake, but for all intents and purposes, they are really very unique to themselves, as kind of like human beings are. In many respects. We all have 2 legs and 2 arms, well, at least most of us do, but the point being is that yet we're all so different in so many ways. But God's creation is much like that. I mean, He, back in Genesis, and I think all of us are well aware of these statements that He made here, when He said in chapter 1, verse, I think the last verse, 31 there, He says, God saw everything that He had made, and behold, it was very good. And at this point, everything was done, pretty much, except for the Sabbath, of course, which came as He rested, He created. Through the act of omitting work, He created a rest. But the point of it is, up to this point, everything physical, the symmetry, the interdependence, the synergy, everything that goes along, photosynthesis. I mean, have you ever thought about photosynthesis? It's an amazing miracle. This whole planet is actually self-sufficient and designed like a giant bubble. And we're all in it, on top of it. But I mean, there's a hood on it that allows us to exist. And we're traveling, spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, traveling at somewhere between 24 and 30,000 miles an hour. I mean, and yet we feel like we're standing still. It's an amazing, amazing thing. I read some material today, or not today, but this week, over the fact that 180 square inches of green leaves actually supplies each of us. That's what we normally consume under an average of breathing. It produces enough air for us, one person, per year, 180 square inches of green leaves, so that the photosynthesis can get created or be caused or be generated, so to speak. It's a very interesting planet, the water. Water in itself is a tremendous miracle. 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen, and it creates this thing, it's called water. I mean, think about that. It's a gas, but it creates like water. Now, I'm not a chemical engineer, but by the same token, I can appreciate the fact that these are kind of miraculous things. And water plays a big part in the creation of things, as well as the destruction of things, as we know by the Noachian deluge that occurred so many years ago. Food chains. You think about the smallest microorganism to the largest animal. What is it, a blue whale? Is that the largest animal on planet Earth today? I think, what is it, they get to about 70 to 80 tons. They can become that large, big, humongous, huge animals. I mean, bigger than some dinosaurs of a bygone era. And yet we talk about neutrons and little microorganisms and bacteria. I used to always be fascinated being in filtration, because in filtration you had to treat the water in some cases with some applications for bacteria. But that wasn't really the only concern you had, because you also had to be concerned of pyrogenic material, which was, believe it or not, the waste of the bacteria. Because bacteria generates waste. And so you had to have filtration devices that sometimes, depending, especially if it was like pharmaceutical manufacturing where they generate serums, you have to filter that out as well because it's got to be, sterile in that respect. So it's an amazing world we live in, and I guess what I'm driving at is it's tremendous in terms of just the reality that we find ourselves embedded in with this great plan that you and I understand in addition. Because when you expand on all of this, I mean, the material world is one thing, and the expanse of all of the physical items, ancillary conditions that we find ourselves in, to understand the spiritual reality, the unseen world, and what is going on, and the method behind what might appear in some cases to be the madness, or the reason behind sometimes what appears to be ambiguous circumstances, is a tremendous advantage, brethren, that you and I have living in this condition of three-dimensional, air-breathing, metabolic existence. With that comes a responsibility, though. The days of unleavened bread, I would hope, throughout the course of these now 7 days almost, has brought back to your attention, through the repetitiveness of eating unleavened bread, the importance of taking in items of God. Now, specifically, of course, the unleavened bread represents the body of Jesus Christ. And of course, the metaphor that in eating unleavened bread every day, which we should have been doing, reminds us of the metabolizing of Christ in us. And what I'm saying is the definition of that Christ in us goes beyond just the recognition of Christ dying for us. I'm not trying to marginalize that. That's important, believe me. And I think we all get that. But moving beyond that, or in addition to, it brings to our mind, or at least it should, that in order for us to make Christ more in us, or for us to be more like Christ, takes effort, takes proactive exercising to engage one's self in actual activity. And there are mandates on us as Christians. Over here in 2 Timothy, I want to turn there for a moment, in 2 Timothy, because Paul, mentioning to this young evangelist, reminds him of some fundamentals that he felt were pretty important for him to comprehend if indeed Timothy expected to be successful at what he was embarking on doing, and that was to develop, hold, maintain a relationship with God through Christ. Right here in chapter 2, 2 Timothy, verse 15, Paul encourages Timothy to study, to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needs not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. And that's so important today, especially in areas of religion, because there are so many people that are playing with the dialogue. They're fooling with the script. They're editing things out and adding things in, taking liberties where liberties ought not to be. And unless you are really in tune with the familiarity that's needed in order to go forward in an honest, transparent, and truthful fashion in your relationship with God, you're only fooling yourself if you think you're going to be able to fend off the barbs of deception, delusion, and ruses that come your way in the world that we live in that is trying to get you to disqualify yourselves. Paul is quite adamant about this in 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians, just a few pages before Timothy there, 1 Thessalonians, and in chapter 4, and in verse 10, I break into the context, and indeed you do it toward all the brethren which are in all Macedonia. But we beseech you. In other words, Paul's complimenting these individuals in Thessalonica for their work and all, but he says, indeed, yes, you do this in all to the brethren in Macedonia, but we beseech you, brethren, regardless of your good activity, regardless of how much you attend church or how much you give in terms of tithes and offerings or in helping hands or all the programs that you involve yourself with in helping other people or charitable works in your life that you exercise exposure to outside of church even. Regardless of all of that, Paul still says, because he's saying here to these folks, I recognize all of that, and it's a good thing you're doing all of that. But regardless of all that, that you continue. Look at this. Here's what he says here in verse 10. He says, but we beseech you, brethren, that you increase more and more, and that you study to be quiet and to do your own business, to work with your hands as we commanded you, that you may walk honestly toward them that are without, and that you may have lack of nothing. The Apostle Peter corroborates what his co-worker Paul mentions over in 2 Peter chapter 3. In verse 18, Peter mentions this, but grow in grace and in knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and to him be glory both now and forever. And I don't need to remind you of the parables of Matthew 25 and of Luke 19, the parables of the talents and pounds. What's that all about? It's about growing. It's about multiplying your talents. It's about taking opportunity and add more pounds to you. I'm talking spiritually here, not physically. but that the genre, the gist of the principle that the Bible is talking to us with and about is very important. We recognize is that we need to be progressive in our development. We need to recognize that, guess what? What we have accomplished today doesn't get us a cup of coffee or a donut tomorrow. We got to keep growing. We got to keep pushing. We got to keep developing. We got to keep improving on, because we are in process. And we have a window right now. And that window is called life. And it's up to us in this life to continue on in the opportunities that come our way, to use those as tools to leverage, hopefully, spiritual muscle in our lives. So it's important. It's important we understand that certain things are going to come our way. It's important that in life, assuming, of course, we don't let the leaven of the world that we live in distract us, get us off course, but that we stay in this unleavened mode of humility, deferring to God, and recognizing, as Paul said here in chapter 9 of the book of Romans, he says, no, verse 20, but, O man, who are you that reply against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, why have you made me thus? Has not the potter power, verse 21, Romans chapter 9, has not the potter power over the clay of the same lump, to make one vessel unto honor, and another, he says here, unto dishonor? What if God, willingly to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted for destruction? And he goes on describing the fact that he reserves the prerogative of him being God. And you've heard me say this almost to ad nauseum, where I've said and appealed to all of us, let God be God in our lives. It's so important from time to time that we recognize that the things that we go through are not to beat us down. The things we go through are not to beat us down. And I know this may sound trite, might even in some cases sound comical to some of us, depending on what the trial we may be going through is. But the reality of it is, trials, tests are opportunities. For what? To exercise the Christian disciplines you don't have, and of which God wants you, through the exercise of exposing you to circumstances outside of your comfort level, to get used to generating new results through the expressions of those disciplines necessary to handle these new exposures that come to you. Notice this. We fail sometimes to recognize the meat of these scriptures. First Peter. Because if God is indeed involved in our lives, then we have to understand that there is a certain element of intervention throughout the course of our lives that take us into certain areas of which afford us opportunities. And I'm going to continue to use that word opportunity because that's what these are. We need to look at our tests. We need to look at our trials and teach ourselves to look at these as opportunities, not problems, but instead challenges. And that's hard because we're not used to necessarily characterizing hardship with those terms. But here in 1 Peter chapter 4, we begin to see some relationship between some of the hardship one may encounter through life versus how we should rest and lay our burdens with Christ. Chapter 4, verse 1, For as much then as Christ has suffered for us in the flesh, and we should know that by now, he has suffered, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind, for he that has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Inverse, if you're not suffering in the flesh, you must be sinning. Now that's a strange view on things. But yet, nevertheless, if we could get this understanding that, you know what, suffering is not all that bad of a thing. And I know it may sound trite. It may sound like, in some cases, an impossibility. Because depending on what that trial may be, and I can list off a whole litany of things here that would certainly illustrate to all of us the drama that can go along with being tried with something. Yet, nevertheless, the psychology of recognizing the reality of the program that all of us are involved with is important that we grasp in the most deepest detail so that the effect of understanding what we understand will have the greatest impact on us, allowing us, almost like an inoculation, allowing us to go through and to slice through problems with hopefully energy and with an attitude of embracing that we might be able then not to become so emotionally dysfunctional that we find ourselves spinning out, abandoning certain principles and integrity in our lives because the oh woe is me bug bites us. And there's no solution to any of our problems, brethren, in the arena of self-pity. What we've got to learn to do is generate, like I mentioned that old donkey in the story that I left you with on the first day of unleavened bread. Shake it off, step up. Shake it off, step up on that story. And that's what's got to be done. Each time another shovel of dirt comes down in the hole, trust where the dirt is coming from. Trust the fact that the dirt is coming at a pace that you can handle. If you couldn't handle it, the guy that's allowing it, which happens to be in this metaphor God, the guy that's allowing it wouldn't be doing it because he's got your best interest at heart. And regardless, though you may think it's coming on you too fast and too much, the reality of it is that you can handle it because that's why it's coming at you the way it is. Learn to exercise a bit of faith, as they would call it. Look at this, 1 Peter chapter 1. Notice what Peter, he's on a roll here along this theme. Chapter 1, he starts this very epistle out. I went to chapter 4, but back in chapter 1, we can't forget these scriptures. He says here, wherein you greatly rejoice, though now for a season, if need be, you are in heaviness through manifold temptations. But why? He says here that the trial of your faith, and this is the underscoring perception, vision we need to hold on to when we find ourselves faced with certain trials and temptations. He says here, being much more precious, your faith being much more precious than of gold that perishes, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen you love, in whom you see him not, yet believing you rejoice with joy unspeakable and full of glory. And remember in Romans 8 where Paul says, I reckon that there's not anything in this world that's worth being compared, no problem worth being compared to the glory that is coming down to us if we'll just hang on and hold tight. It's so important, brethren, that we don't let the leaven of this world essentially nail us and take us out of the race. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and in verse 15. For all these things are for your sakes, that the abundant grace might, through the thanksgiving of many, redound or rebound or essentially reflect to the glory of God. For which cause we faint not, we do not become weary. But though our outward man perishes, each one of us are dying every day. I'm a little closer to death than I was 30 seconds ago. I'm a little closer to death today. I'm dying as you're watching me die right in front of you. Well, that's morbid, but nevertheless, that's life. We're all in the same boat. I'm doing the same thing for you guys because I'm looking at you. But that's reality. And the flesh was never intended to last forever, so we understand that, and therefore it's not morbid in this regard in the context that we're reading here. He says, the outward man perishes, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. How does that make sense? Because spiritually, brethren, if indeed we're following the scriptures that I mentioned at the outset, and we're growing day in and day out, taking opportunity to leverage more spiritual muscle as temptations and trials come down on us and the dirt is on the back and we're shaking it off and stepping up through the course of our lives all the time. Guess what? We're going to be growing inwardly. That inward man is going to be beginning to develop good muscle. He says here, verse 17, for our light affliction, that's what Paul's saying here, our light affliction, which is but for a moment, and he's being very positive because he's saying all affliction is light, essentially, is what he's saying here. He says, our light affliction, which is but for a moment, works for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight, while we mark, that's the Greek word, mark, same word that is used in a negative sense of marking those who pass and spread heresy among the brethren. It's the same meaning, look, take note, be aware, he says, not at the things which are seen, but on the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. And so it is, brethren, in this case, that what we see, we should have our minds not on, because oftentimes what we see can distract us. It can deflect us and capture us and enamor us. And first thing you know, we're forgetting about the things that are not seen. And being physical and material, it's much easier. Believe you me. You ever hear the term out of sight, out of mind? Well, the spiritual world is out of sight. And most certainly is major reason why it's out of the minds of most people. Because it's spiritual. It's not physical. It cannot be weighed, evaluated, and assessed by the five senses that we have. So it's important. It's important that we do our duty for God in the activity of life that He, God, has for us. He says in many regards a lot of very good bits of information in the book of Proverbs. I want to share just two of them with us, with the illustration in mind of how we should be working in developing ourselves spiritually. In chapter 25 and in 28, he says here of the book of Proverbs, he that has no rule over his own spirit is like a city that is broken down and without walls. You're unguarded. There's no boundaries. In essence, modern lingo, you're dog meat because you can't control your anger. You can't control your emotions. You're more reactionary than you should be because you're operating out of how you feel. You know, everything is about how you feel today. I feel like a woman, so I should be able to go into that bathroom. You know, I feel like this, so you should defer to my feelings even though the logic doesn't make sense. And hence, and sadly, we end up losing a lot of common sense in some of these modern-day rationales that people nowadays are using. Chapter 16, book of Proverbs. Here's another one, chapter 16. He that is slow to anger, verse 32, chapter 16. He that's slow to anger, book of Proverbs, is better than the mighty. He that's slow to anger is better than the mighty. He that rules his spirit than he that actually takes a city. The lot is cast into the lap. That's kind of like saying you got to play the hand you're dealt. You got to play the hand you're dealt. What all of a sudden falls in your lap, that's the lot. That's the destiny. That is the rough. That is the purpose. That's what's going to now define certain activity for the next week, day, minute, year. That's the hand I'm dealt. But the whole disposing thereof, the whole verdict, sentence, the whole justice, the whole judgment, there is of God. In other words, He's watching. What are you going to do with this lot in your lap? How do you respond? How are you going to respond differently this time than you did the last time because you failed that one? So I'm giving you another opportunity here. Are you going to do better? Are you recognizing the patterns through your de-leavening effort? Is the sin that you are attempting over this last week of becoming very intensely aware of actually dissipating? Actually making some progress in what is called conversion, whereby we are actually able to measure some changing results. That our personality is actually changing, surprisingly. Because it should. It should. That's what this whole program is all about. So these are important items to keep in mind. I want to leave you with some points today to help us continue to de-leaven ourselves. I'd like to start off with this first one. And over here in Ephesians 4, I'd like to turn there for a moment, in Ephesians 4, bring your attention to this, because it's very important that we master our talents. That we master our talents and our gifts. Those things that we know we're strong in. Brethren, learn to leverage change from your strengths. Learn to leverage change from your strengths. Rally around your strengths in hopes that that will help you to overcome certain weaknesses. Learn to identify and master your talents. Ephesians 4, verse 7, but unto every one of us is given grace according to the measure of the gift of Christ. Wherefore, he says, verse 8 of chapter 4, book of Ephesians, when he ascended up on high, he led a multitude captive, or a captivity captive, but the Greek would be multitude. In other words, when he ascended to the Father, there were followers, people convinced, and he gave gifts unto men. Every one of us in this room has gifts. Every one of us have certain talents. We've all been given those. God is looking for us to multiply them. The parable of the talents, the parable of the pounds, the fact that we should be growing in grace and knowledge, progressive. I could show you over there in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38, which was a mantra of mine all my life. All my life, I abided, or I tried to stay true to the integrity of Hebrews 10, verse 38, which was, my spirit takes no pleasure in those who draw back, which goes to the point of the best defense is a good offense. Don't let life cause you to become dysfunctional. Don't let life hit you off your mark or get you off your course or knock you out of the saddle. I could use all kinds of little cliches. The point of it is you stay true to yourself. Stay true to the integrity that you have. Don't draw back. As things get tougher, you double down and dive even stronger into those circumstances, trying to figure your way through it. And even if you don't know it, the best defense is a good offense. Go for it. Embrace the circumstances and do the best you can as you become familiar with those circumstances to begin to figure out how to maneuver, how to recognize. But brethren, this stuff doesn't happen by fiat. It happens through taking some time on the Sabbath. Quiet time. Thinking. Reflecting. Why did I lose my temper? Why did I say that? I need to do something different. People are reacting to me this way for too long. Do I need to listen more and talk less? Probably I do, yeah. Do I need to wear my hair differently? Do I need to, look differently? Do I need to change up my ways somehow that I'm a little bit less, maybe I do come across intimidating. Am I easy to entreat? How do I become more easy to entreat? Now that's a good question. Why don't you get a book and study it? Why don't you start reading some Proverbs? There's a lot of stuff in there that'll go to the point of humility. There's a lot of things here. The book of Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon, which is the metaphor of God's relationship with his church. A tremendous book to be read, actually, during this season. Those of you who haven't read the book of Solomon in a while, this is a good time of the season to read the love between God and his church through the reality of Solomon and this woman that he was involved with. It's a tremendous, tremendous book and a tremendous story. Hebrews 10, verse 38, I referenced it with regard to the fact of not drawing back and to be more humble in our approach toward our lives is certainly a very, very good point to keep in mind. And of course, Ecclesiastes 9:10. Ecclesiastes 9:10. Don't do things haphazardly. If you're going to commit to something, then do it with all your might. That's what Ecclesiastes 9:10 says. Do it with all your might. Put yourself into it. Don't do it haphazardly. If you're going to do it haphazardly, then don't do it, because it may just lead you to become disappointed, and then you're going to bring on more burdens to yourself, because now you're going to have to deal with your disappointment. And along with disappointment can come depression. Along with depression can come despondence. Now you're adding, one burden upon another, because it all started when you got involved with this and you went at it haphazardly. If you're going to go into business for yourself, like I did some years ago, believe you me, you don't do it haphazardly. If you're going to make a commitment to a woman or to a man and get into a relationship of marriage, you don't do it haphazardly. You need to be methodic, not feelings. You need to think through. You're going to have a child? Can we afford it? Or can't we? Some cases, if you wait to afford it, you'll probably never have a child, but that's another story. But the bottom line is, brethren, do it with all your might. Master your talents. Recognize your gifts. The sooner you do that, then you'll be able to leverage off those strengths, hopefully to help better overcome your weaknesses. Build on your strengths. Point 2, master our needs and wants. Now, this is an important distinction. There is a distinction between needs and wants, and it's important that you grasp this distinction between the two so that you can recognize where to prioritize. Because a key to successful living, these 3 points: Key to successful living. Prioritize, prioritize, prioritize. And the way to prioritize, real simple, a good outline, a good format, a good template to use in trying to determine your priorities is to put on the two columns, needs and wants. Needs and wants. And so you have certain needs. Make sure you get those needs put to bed first before you go after your wants. The wants can come later. You've got a whole lifetime. Some of us do. Others of us, like myself, are in their 6.5 week, 6.5 weeks. I'm 65 years old. I'm 6.5 weeks now old in this Feast of Weeks in the count. Remember going back on the couple of sermons I gave years ago. And our lives, just continue to go forward. But for some of us, we have a lot of years that we can figure out certain needs and then let those needs be addressed so that the wants can be obtained. Oftentimes, we put the wants before the needs, and guess what? Because we went at it bass-ackwards, we find ourselves on the short end of the stick years down the road. So it's important. It's important that we recognize these things. Back to book of Proverbs. Wow, a lot of wisdom in Proverbs. I think all of us should read Proverbs daily. Wouldn't be a bad idea to remind us of the wisdom that is in this book. So simple statements, but yet nevertheless so pertinent and poignant to successful living in so many regards. Here, chapter 21 and in verse 17. Get this right. Master your needs and your wants. Here it is, verse 17. He that loves pleasure or sport shall be a poor man. Why? Because the leaven of pleasure, the leaven of sport will distract you, slow you down, and waste your time. Because guess what? Every day you get up, go! The clock is ticking. The race is on. You hit the bed, stop! How many laps did you make? How fast did you make it? Next morning, go! When I'm with my grandson, we were racing around bases. We were out at the ball field last week, and we were racing each other. And I had a stopwatch on my telephone, and we were running the bases, from home plate all the way around, fast. Go, Preston, go, go, go! Go, Papa, go, go, go! And we'd run, and then we'd cross. But life's that way. Every time you get up, you're running the bases. And when you get back home, how fast did you do? What did you accomplish? What was the results of all that you did? Get up! That's what the Bible's saying. You love sport? Time is going to pass you by. It's just going to pass you by. He says here, he that loves wine and oil shall not be rich. The wicked shall be a ransom for the righteous, and the transgressor for the upright. It is better to dwell in the wilderness. Now I'm distracting myself here. The wilderness than a contentious woman. We won't go there. I mean, that's wrong. That's another subject. Drop it down to verse 25. Verse 25. The desire of the slothful kills him, for his hands refuse to labor. He covets greedily all day long. I want what he has. Oh, I should have that Maserati. I should have the silk tie. Why? I should have those nice high heels or that dress. I'm entitled to these things. But they don't want to work for it. They want it, but they forget about, the need you have to have or obtain in order to get it. That's part of the problem that we have today in our society at large. Too many people feel entitled when in fact they're not working for what they rightfully want. They want to live off of others and take from you so that he can have it that you can't even afford because you're giving all yours to him. And that's unfortunate in the world that we're living in today. He covets greedily all day long, but the righteous gives and spares not. Matthew 6:24, verse 34 tells us, look, keep your eyes focused on the kingdom. that will hopefully, in the broad picture of things, keep the spiritual priorities focused so that you can keep the physical material leaven to a minimum, or at least distracting you to a minimum. Your ultimate goal, your ultimate aim, brethren, is you're living for the short term, the millennium, the long term, eternity with the Father here on earth. Remember, the millennium is just a short-term experience. All we're doing there is for 1,000 years preparing the world for the rest of the dead. Don't get fixed on the millennium. The millennium is just the beginning. It's the warm-up phase. It's essentially the pregame, because the real target is the new heaven and the new earth, with the Father on earth. That's our real target, brethren. Of course, the short term, get into the millennium, because if you're in the millennium, you'll be in eternity. You've got that made for sure, without a question. But the reality of it is that we need to keep our eyes focused on God's kingdom first and foremost. So, therefore, let's go back to the law here. I love this portion of the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 30. Deuteronomy chapter 30. Because this is so important. It's real simple. It's real simple. When in fact trying to essentially, in this particular case, master our needs and wants. Verse 15, Deuteronomy 30, here it is. Moses writing on behalf of God. See, I've set before you this day life and good, death and evil. I've set both of these things in front of you. Life and good, death and evil. In that I command you, I'm mandating you this day, love the Lord your God. Walk in his ways, keep his commandments and his statutes, his judgments, that you may live and multiply, and the Lord your God shall bless you in the land where you go to possess it. But if in your heart you turn away, verse 17, chapter 30, Deuteronomy, so that you will not hear, but shall be drawn away and worship other gods and serve them. And those other gods don't have to be pagan gods, because I think in many cases here in the West especially, we're above the fact of bowing down to statues. I mean, that's kind of archaic, that's kind of primitive and superstitious, and a lot of us are beyond that in our intelligentsia and in our highly developed world that we live in. But the fact of it is, many of us allow ourselves to become the God and put ourselves in front of God. And consequently, as I've often said, make God into our own image, thereby again distracting his will in our lives. I denounce, he says, verse 18, unto you this day that you shall surely perish. You shall not prolong your days upon the land where you pass over Jordan to go and possess it. I've called heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, real simple, choose life, that both you and your seed may live. Choose life. Point 3, master your attitude and your emotions. Wow, this is the big one. This is the big one, brethren, because we are so emotional. In us is just a hodgepodge, a cauldron, a soup of all kinds of potentialities, jealousies, envies, mockeries, hate, vengeance, joy, enamored, excitability, hyperbole, positive and both negative. We have triggers in each of us that we need to be so aware of, because whatever that trigger may be, and of which sometimes we don't even recognize what those triggers are until certain circumstances come our way. And that's why what we're reading here is so interesting, because it's those opportunities, quote unquote, opportunities that give us the freedom to exercise something new in us to generate a new result. So when something does trigger us, don't get upset. Don't resist, but instead recognize, resist and replace. use it to leverage. Use it to leverage change in your life by bringing everything to Christ, reflecting the Christ in you, and if it doesn't measure up, get rid of it or do the best you can to marginalize it, minimize it. Obviously, the best thing is eliminate it, but oftentimes, because we've got habits that have grown over decades in our lives, it's not always easy to extract habits that have developed over 20, 30, 40, 50, or 60 years. But hopefully, God willing, if we keep trying, and that's the whole point of being progressive in this development of growing in grace and knowledge, we are in tune with and therefore targeting and aiming for whatever is coming at us to recognize, resist, and replace for the glory of God. And so he says here, over in this particular case in Jeremiah chapter 17, beware. And this is an important scripture to take note of, because there's another scripture attached to this we don't normally give press to, but I want to take a moment here to do. And that is in verse 9. Many of you are well aware of this one. Chapter 17, book of Jeremiah, 17. Verse 9, the heart is deceitful above all things, desperately wicked. Who can know it? We are the most rationalizing beings. We can rationalize ourselves out of almost anything we are confronted with. We can try to make an excuse to justify why we did something to make us look good and you look bad. And we are masters at it in some cases, and some of us are better at it than others. And many of those guys that get real good at it, they become lawyers. But nevertheless, the fact of it is that this is very real. The heart itself is very delusional. Sometimes we're not even aware that we're actually working an agenda, when in fact we are. The agenda is against our own selves, to deceive ourselves into allowing a certain activity that we know is wrong, but we're rationalizing the fact. Well, I need the carbs, so I'll just have another piece of cake. It makes me feel so good. Certainly God can't be against me feeling good. This second scripture is a real good one, though. Notice this. I, the Lord, search the heart. I try. Now, I'm going to take the Hebrew. There's another meaning to this. I examine, I prove the reins, even to give every man according to his ways and according to the fruit of his doings. You've heard me say that we are the sum total of our decisions. We are oftentimes the reflection and manifestation of the sum total of what we've decided to do in our life over the course of years. And over the course of years, we, as human beings, take on the persona, even the personification of our choices in some cases. We begin to look certain ways. If we're tense and stressed throughout life, we start walking around like this. We start getting wrinkles in our face where we never had wrinkles before. Why? Because we're always tensed up. We're just always walking around like this because we're not happy anymore. We're just mean old curmudgeons because we got no joy in our life. I got too many problems. When in fact you look in the mirror and you say, when did all this happen? And it's been happening over years incrementally, and you don't realize it because incrementalism is really the pathway to oftentimes change that usually, or sometimes, I'll say sometimes, is not always that good. You're always better if you and God are in the driver's seat, meaning the best defense against wrinkles is a good offense. Realize how you're feeling. Realize how you're looking right off the bat. And don't let those years pile up to where you begin to change physically and or even emotionally. We have to be careful. Again, those opportunities that come our way. Remember the dirt going down on that donkey. The dirt on that donkey is not to bury the donkey. The dirt on the donkey is so that the donkey learns how to shake it off and step up. That's what it's all about. I didn't mean to have this donkey theme going through the whole taste of unleavened bread, but it seems to work. So I'm just using it from the standpoint of the picturing of what God wants us to understand is important for us to grow in consistency with, because He's not out to get us. God is our best coach. He has our best interests at heart. We need to recognize that and give it up and embrace it. Believe it, take it to heart, and understand anything coming your way is an opportunity for you to grow. Anything coming your way is an opportunity for you to grow. A challenge is how you grow. You build muscle through resistance, right? What is that they call? Isometrics, I think it is. Isometrics, weightlifting too. Everything that you build, if you're going to build muscle, you've got to have a certain element of resistance. And if you're going to improve in the skill of something, you've got to practice. You're going to be a good shortstop. I got my good buddy here, Del Russian, who was a second baseman years ago in the Worldwide Church of God when we used to play ball. And we were kind of the dynamic duo back in those days. And you don't learn each other and have a connection with each other unless you practice with each other. We'd throw balls to each other all the time, throwing and learning. Catch ball out of the glove fast. Do things to improve your skill level. Those are important things to do and to get used to. And so it is here in this particular case as we learn that the Lord is actually watching us. He's trying to determine, are we making good progress here? Are we changing our attitudes about certain things? Last point that I want to make. Master your tongue. Master your tongue. And this is an important element in our lives. The book of James, and in chapter 3, we read this: My brethren, be not many masters, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. For in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body. And that is true. There's probably not a person in this room that hasn't offended somebody with some word that they've used or some attitude that they've expressed at some point in the relationship of somebody that in their lives they have basically caused a rift in that relationship between somebody, whether it's on the job or what, or even in a relationship with your mate or children. He goes on here, Behold, we put bits in the horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn about the whole body. We put with ships, though they be so great and are driven by fierce winds, yet are they turned about with a very small helm, wherever they go. Even so, the tongue, a little member, and boasts great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindles. And we see that in politics. We see that in religion. We see that played out in the public square through legislation and or certain personalities of Hollywood icons, sports stars. We see the tongue wagging out there, saying all kinds of things, generating all kinds of attention and creating all kinds of issues, even at the expense of stepping on the toes of others, as they insist on having their will being imposed on the will of others. The tongue is certainly behind a lot of that. And the tongue, verse 6, is a fire, a world of iniquity. So is the tongue among our members, that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature. And it is set on fire, or Gehenna, of hell, basically, a Gehenna fire. For every kind of beast and bird and serpent and of things in the sea is tamed and has been tamed of mankind. But the tongue can no man tame. It is unruly evil and full of deadly poison. And boy, I'll tell you what, there have been some experiences in my life, as I'm sure you could share with me in your life, where the tongue has really been the underscoring cause of problems that have been generated that you might find yourself in the middle of. So we need to understand that the tongue is certainly something that needs to be controlled. It needs to be pulled back, reined in, as they say. Be thoughtful. Don't be reactionary. Reactionaryism is essentially one of the biggest faults, causes, reasons for saying things that you don't mean. How many times have we, through the course of our life, Finally, in our quiet time, think back, why did I say that? Why did I say that? I should have never said that. I didn't need to say that. But the trigger triggered you, and you weren't quick enough to recognize, resist, and replace. And so it got by your gate, and lo and behold, the Trojan horse was in, and you went, blah, said something you shouldn't have said, because the Trojan horse bit you, and got in your gate. So watch that. Watch that, brethren. Master yourselves in these ways. Recognize your talents and gifts, and make the distinction between needs and wants. Control your attitude and emotions, and watch your tongue. Now, before I close, in conclusion here, I wanted to share with you, and I didn't bring my handouts with me. Forgot them on my desk. But I want to add these 10 commandments that I will provide tomorrow. I'll send these with Margie to all of you. But I want you to keep in mind these 10 other commandments. Author is unknown. But this was sent to me by a good friend in the church, and it is really, I believe, fascinating. You shall not worry, for worry is the most unproductive of all human activities. 2, you shall not be fearful, for most of the things we fear never come to pass. 3, you shall not carry grudges, for they are the heaviest of all of life's burdens. You shall face 4, each problem as it comes. You can only handle one at a time anyway. And if you have to multitask, learn to prioritize. Learn to prioritize. 5, you shall not take problems to bed with you, for they make very poor bedfellows. 6, you shall not borrow other people's problems. They can better care for them than you. That's a very common fault in ministry or in counseling careers, where the counselor or minister takes on the problems of those he's counseling or having interaction with, and ultimately the people that have the problem end up turning out okay in the long run. In the meantime, the minister has the nervous breakdown. But nevertheless, you shall not borrow other people's problems. Let them take care of it themselves. They're best suited for it. And remember this, too. It's not your trial. It's theirs. Do the best you can to help them through it, if indeed you have the means by which and are suited to be able to help them. And that's another thing. If you're not suited, get out of the way. Defer it. Don't take it upon yourself thinking that you can help, when in fact, because you're not suited, you do more damage. You do more damage. You need to be very, very prudent and wise in those areas. 7, you shall not try to relive yesterday, You shall not try to relive yesterday, for good or ill. It is forever gone. Now concentrate on what is happening in your life. Be happy now. Live in the moment is what's saying here. 8, you shall be a good listener. For only when you listen do you hear ideas different from your own. It is hard to learn something new when you are talking. And some people do not know more, and some people do know more than you do. 9, you shall not become bogged down by frustration, for most of it is rooted in self-pity and will only interfere with positive action. 10, you should count your blessings, never overlooking the small ones, for a lot of small blessings add up to the big ones. I'll go ahead and bring my handouts tomorrow with Margie. She'll deliver them in that. So in closing, Ephesians chapter 6, notice this. Chapter 6 and in verse 10, finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. And you can read the rest today at some point. Put on the armor of God. Buckle yourselves up. It is getting tough out there. The leaven in the world that we live in today is multiplying exponentially. It really is. And it's not getting any easier for any of us. Recognize the need for you to cuddle up to God. Make Him your bedfellow. Make him close to you. Develop the relationship you need that will better suit you for dealing with the opportunities and the challenges that you're faced with. And the best way, the most assured way of making sure that you're prepared to handle those darts from the devil is to be suited in the armor of God.